Okay, good to see everybody for Torah study today. Our portion is VaEra and begins on page 351 in the Eitz Chaim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shekidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So what I wanted to talk about today are three um, 3 points from this portion that represent kind of more global issues related to theology, to and to the role of God in the world and things like that. So even though it's the specific portion of VaEra, there are a couple of themes that are can be more broadly learned from this portion. So VaEra is the portion in which we learn about 7 of the 10 plagues that strike Egypt, and so we'll get to that in a little bit too. I wanted to look at the very first verse, which just begs a question too. So again, we're on 351. Whatever edition of Chumash you have, it's Exodus chapter 6, verse 2. Vayedaber Elohim el Moshe, Vayomer elav ani Adonai. The English translation, God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord, doesn't necessarily point out the stark what we see in the Hebrew. So Elohim spoke to Moses and said to Moses, I am Adonai. So in the English, God and Lord we could see as just a narrative style, not to repeat the same word over and over again. But in the Hebrew, it's more than that. There's Elohim in the verse, and there's Adonai in the verse. And that could be the same. It could have the original intention that the English does, that it's just 2 words that mean the same thing, and it's just we go back and forth with those names. It's like Jacob and Israel at the end of the book of Genesis. Sometimes Jacob is called Jacob, sometimes Jacob is called Israel. Do we want to learn something more from that? It's unclear that we do. Maybe it's the same thing with the name of God, Elohim and Adonai, but certainly the rabbis don't see it that way. The rabbis see that Elohim and Adonai are 2 very distinct names of God that represent different characteristics of God. Elohim is always associated with the God of justice, and Adonai, Yud-He Vav-He, is always associated with God of mercy. So whenever Adonai is used, we're supposed to understand some merciful element to God's attribute that is coming out in that part of the story. Whenever Elohim is used, then it's an element of justice that comes out in the story. So before we read below the line, I just want to point out, if we have the Eitz Chaim with us, let's just look at the very beginning of the Torah, where the names of God come out in the story. So if you turn to page, just one second. If you turn to page 3, the very beginning of the Torah, page 3, Genesis 1:1, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, Elohim created heaven and earth. And throughout chapter 1, it's Elohim. That's the only name of God that is used in the story in all of chapter 1 as Elohim creates the world. Each day of creation, Elohim does something or a few things that day. And every day is introduced, Vayomer Elohim, Vayomer Elohim. So it's Elohim throughout entire chapter 1, but then you get to chapter 2, and chapter 2, verse, just a second. Yes, chapter 2, verse 4. So this is on page 12 and 13. So after Shabbat is dealt with, the first 3 sentences of chapter 2, where it's Elohim there too, in verse 4, on page 12, chapter 2, verse 4, Eile toldot hashamayim veha'aretz bihi bar'am. This is the history of the heaven and the earth when they were created. Page 13, Biyom asot Adonai Elohim eretz v'shamayim. On the day that Adonai Elohim made heaven and earth. All of a sudden, a new name of God is introduced in the story. And Adonai Elohim, the combination, is used in chapter 2. Now, one more thing before we get to below the line on page 351. So, verse 2 here, the very first verse of VaEra, Elohim spoke to Moses and said to him, I am Adonai. And from now on, it is Adonai. If you look at 353, verse 10, Vayedaber Adonai El Moshe Lemor. And it's Adonai throughout the story now until the 10 Commandments, where we just keep your place here, but if we go to the beginning of chapter 20, page 441, we have Vayedaber Elohim et kol hadvarim ha'ele lemor, 442, Anochi Adonai Elohecha. So we've had Adonai now, chapter 6 through chapter 19, and then chapter 20, when God speaks the 10 Commandments, and this is the record of it, Elohim spoke all these words, saying, I am Adonai, your God, who brought you out of Egypt. So, even if we understand that Elohim and Adonai are interchangeable, it still begs the question, if they're interchangeable, why Elohim for all of chapter 1 of Genesis, but Adonai Elohim for chapter 2 of Genesis? Why Elohim for the first 5 chapters of Exodus, Adonai for chapters 6 through 19, and then Elohim again in chapter 20? So that begs the question that I don't have an answer to, but the below the line might have an answer to it. So let's look on 351, the bottom left, I am the Lord. According to the Midrash, God has 2 attributes: justice, represented by the divine name Elohim, translated God, and mercy, represented by the divine name Yud-He-Vav-He, translated the Lord. So that could be our translation here in Eitz Chaim is the JPS, the Jewish Publication Society translation. And if you look at the introduction to their translation, it might say in there that every time that God's name is Elohim, we use God. Every time it's Yud-He-Vav-He, we use Lord. Okay, so again, you have to. we have to understand the Midrash to understand the difference now between Elohim and Adonai. It's based on Midrash that we understand that Elohim is the aspect of justice, and Yud He Vav He, Adonai, pronounced Adonai, is the aspect of mercy. Okay, so within rabbinic understanding of God, those are two very important attributes of God that are focused on the high holidays when we pray to be forgiven by means of asking God to move from the sitting on the throne of justice to sit instead on a throne of mercy. Okay, so it becomes this liturgical, theological, spiritual process on the high holidays, incorporating those names of God in that way. But the rabbis then are reading back into the Torah and applying their interpretation of those names of God to their placement in the Torah itself. So what I'm suggesting is that the Torah might not have thought of that when the Torah was written, but instead we read the Torah, because we can't help it, because we've learned the Torah through the lens of rabbinic interpretation. We can't help be thinking what Elohim and Adonai mean. Okay, so it's very hard to, once we've been brought up all of our lives in Hebrew school, in day school, in synagogue, in the prayer book, to understand Adonai means mercy and Elohim means justice. It's very hard to read the Torah. It's very hard not to read the Torah using those same definitions and those same attributes. All I'm suggesting is that maybe the Torah didn't have that in mind. But let's continue reading this commentary here to understand how the Midrash understands the role of Elohim and Adonai in the Exodus story. So this verse would seem to represent a conflict within God in which the attribute of justice would chastise Moses for seeming to lose faith. Why did you bring harm upon this people? From chapter 5, verse 22, why have you waited while so many have suffered and died? When the redemption occurs, it will be too late for them. Elohim, the divine attribute of justice, wants to strike at Moses for speaking thus, but the attribute of mercy speaks out and saves him, realizing that he was speaking in that tone on behalf of people who have suffered so much for so long. So in other words, in looking at the end of chapter 5, if we just turn back a little bit here. So here, if we turn to page 340, this is what the Midrash here quoted below the line on 351 is referring to. On 340, then Moses returned to the Lord and said, O Lord, why did you bring harm upon this people? Why did you send me? Now, he calls God Adonai, and right, the Torah says he's returning to Adonai, Yud He Vav He, and he says Adonai Aleph Daled Nun Yud, which sounds the same as Yud He Vav He, the way we pronounce Yud He Vav He, but it's written differently. So Adonai really means my master. It really means my Lord, Lord being master. Okay? So my master, why have you brought harm to this people? Why did you send me? Right? And so this is, so he is speaking to God. So God might want to respond as Elohim, but God is responding here in verse 3 as Adonai Yud He Vav He. So that's the Midrash understanding why God's name changes. Because if God only responded as Elohim, then maybe Moses would be punished for daring to speak out to God in this way. But speaking as Adonai, Yud He Vav He, as God does in verse 3, then we see that God is merciful to him. So this assumes that God wrote the Torah, and God is writing how God wants to be referred to in the particular part of the story. Okay, that's what it assumes. So now, so the end of that first paragraph on the right column, this is the last time that the divine name Elohim Justice appears in any speech of God to Moses. Henceforth, it will always be Yud He Vav He, mercy. Okay? So the speaking of the Ten Commandments, God isn't speaking to Moses at that point, at the beginning of verse 20. God is speaking to the people of Israel that are standing at Mount Sinai. Every place else in the Torah, from now on, God speaks to Moses as Adonai. Okay? A modern midrashic interpretation. Why did God speak to Moses exclusively in the name of the attribute of mercy from this moment on? Hearing Moses' concern for those who had not lived to see the liberation from slavery, God declared, I cannot judge this man. He is as righteous a judge as I. Therefore, I will speak to him only with the voice of mercy, for the burden of caring for the Israelites is so great, and only Moses is merciful enough to do it. Right? There are times throughout the rest of the Torah that Moses is praying to God on behalf of the people to ask God to forgive them of their sin, whether it's the golden calf or whether it's begging for water, or whether it's with believing in the report of the 10 spies about not being able to defeat the inhabitants of the land of Israel. All those times, Moses prays on their behalf for God to forgive them. Another modern midrashic interpretation, to the patriarchs, I revealed myself as a nurturing, mothering God. Some suggest that Shaddai, right, God is referred to as El Shaddai a few times in Genesis, may be related to the word Shaddayim, meaning breasts. So the nurturing, mothering aspect. My relationship to them was that of a parent to child, encouraging and forgiving, making few demands. But with this man Moses, I will speak face to face as one adult to another. I will reveal to him my personal intimate name, Yud He Vav He. Moreover, because Moses defends the cause of the Israelites so passionately, I will show this side of my nature to them as well. And you shall know that I, Yud He Vav He, am your God who freed you from the labors of the Egyptians. God of your fathers is the God of Genesis. Yud He Vav He is the God of Exodus. Okay, so it provides the change of name from Elohim to Yud He Vav He, or just the use of those names provides material for interpretation and some lessons to be learned. So whether that was the original intention of the Torah, it's unclear, but certainly it's within our right to interpret the text in this way and to learn deeper lessons that may not have been the original intention of the Torah. So the idea that God is leading the Israelites out of Egypt with mercy rather than justice, it's an interesting question, right? Isn't it a just cause to release a nation from bondage? Isn't it a just cause to lead them back to the land, to their homeland? We would imagine that the argument that is a just thing to do, but perhaps it's more of the aspect of mercy that is incorporated into God's role in the story. So I don't know. We can say a lot of things about that. Another thing that comes up that I wanted to say is right on page 352, and then with the time that we have left after that, we'll talk about the role of God in the story. So here, I'm sorry, back to 351, verse 3. VaEra el Avraham, el Yitzchak, ve'el Yaakov, be'el Shaddai, ushemi Adonai lo nodati lahem. So I showed myself to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as El Shaddai, and my name Yud He Vav He, my name Adonai, I did not let it be known to them. 4. Vagam hakimoti et briti itam, latet lahem et eretz Canaan, et eretz migurehem, asher garuva. And I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land of their dwelling that they were dwelling in. Right? So God says to Moses, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob knew God as El Shaddai, and I also established a covenant with them about the land being theirs for all time. 5. V'gam ani shamati et na'akat b'nei Yisrael, asher Mitzrayim ma'avidim otam, va'ezkor et briti. And also I heard the moaning of the people of Israel, that Egypt had enslaved them or subjected them to slavery, and I remembered my covenant. Right? So now is the time, God is saying to Moses, that the moaning of the people of the people of Israel in Egypt triggered God to remember the covenant. 6. Lachein emor livnei Yisrael, ani Adonai, vehotzeti etchem mitachat sivlot Mitzrayim, vehitzalti etchem me'avodatam, vega'alti etchem bizroa netuya uvishfatim gedolim, velakachti etchem li la'am, vehayiti lachem le'elohim, vidatem ki ani Adonai Elohechem, hamotzi etchem mitachat sivlot Mitzrayim, veheveti etchem el haaretz, asher nasati et yadi, latet ota Avraham, liyitzchak uliyaakov, venatati ota lachem morasha ani Adonai. Therefore, back to verse 6, translating now all these 6 through 8, therefore say to the people of Israel, I am Adonai, and I will bring you out from under the suffering of Egypt. I will bring you out, number 1. I will save you from their slavery. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great signs. No, extraordinary chastisements. Okay. I will take you to me as a nation, and I will be for you Elohim. That's interesting. Tell the people that I am Adonai, and I will be for you Elohim. That's interesting, right? Why? I will be for you Adonai. Why should I be for you Elohim? If God is saying, tell the people that I am Adonai. So what does that mean? I am Adonai, but I'll be for you as an Elohim. What is the difference? Okay, we'll get to that. We'll talk more about that in a second. And know that I am Adonai, your God, who brings you out from under the suffering of Egypt. And verse 8, and I will bring you to the land that I raised up my hand to give it to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob, and I will give it to you as an inheritance or as a possession. I am Adonai. Okay, so there are 5 verbs here that relate to the Passover Seder. There are 4 verbs about the process of bringing the people out of Egypt: hotseti, hitzalti, ga'alti, lakachti. Okay, so 6 and 7 have those 4 verbs. Hotseti, I'll bring you out. Hitzalti, I'll save you. Ga'alti, I'll redeem you. Lakachti, I'll take you. And verse 8 has a 5th one, veheveti, and I'll bring you. So how does this relate to the Passover Seder? 4 cups of wine for those 4 action words about bringing us out of Egypt. So we have the 4 cups of wine over the course of the Seder to remind us of the course of the Exodus. And we have the 5th cup of wine, which we don't drink from, because that's the cup for Elijah. That is the one to remind us of the promise to be brought back to the land of Israel. So it's just interesting that the Seder itself is kind of written, or the Seder that we do is more of a diaspora or exile Seder, because the 5th cup we don't drink from, we leave it on the table, representing possibly an idea that we haven't been brought back to the land of Israel yet. But there are those who are in the state of Israel today who would argue that point, obviously, because the state of Israel exists and people can return to the state of Israel. But there are those who say we don't really return to Israel until the temple is rebuilt and the kingdom of David, the dynasty of David, is restored there. So that 5th verse, 5th word, I will bring you back to the land, is an integral part to the Exodus. Exodus isn't complete. The freedom from slavery isn't complete until the people are brought to the land of Israel. So some would argue then, why does the Torah end where it does, with the death of Moses and the people on the other side of the Jordan River from the land of Israel? Shouldn't the story of the Torah have ended when they crossed the Jordan River in the first couple of chapters of the book of Joshua? So that's just a question, just in terms of how we understand the course of Jewish history, right? And this was even taught to me in my modern Jewish history class at the Jewish Theological Seminary. How do we define modern Jewish history? When does modern Jewish history begin? So Jewish scholars of Jewish history who live outside of Israel define modern Jewish history with the French Revolution, not the American Revolution, the French Revolution, when Jews were allowed to live anywhere they want and not in a ghetto, and given citizenship of the land that they live in. So modern Jewish history begins in 1789 with the French Revolution, my professor taught. But so that's it, because the nature of the Jewish community changed from an insulated, very Jewish in practice and belief community to a very open, responding to assimilation into the greater society. So that's how modern Jewish history is defined for Jewish historians outside of Israel. But Israeli Jewish historians define modern Jewish history from beginning in the 1600s, when there begins a movement of groups of people to move from Europe to live in the land of Israel. So it's just a fascinating idea. So that starts well, with like the Khmelnytsky pogroms in the 1600s in Poland, where people start to think, you know what, there's no hope for us in Europe anymore. There's no place for us here. Let's move to Israel. And from then and then up when the 1880s, where mass migration begins, that's a defining moment of modern Jewish history. So it's fascinating that freedom and the process of becoming a people is not complete until there's a placement of that people in the land of Israel. So it's not just freedom, it's not just exodus from Egypt and freedom from slavery, but it's also getting to the land of Israel itself, right? So we have to understand the process of freedom as a process of being freed from bondage, getting to Mount Sinai to get the laws that define our people, that define us as a people, and then getting to the land of Israel where we can live out our lives as free people with the Torah as our guideline, as our guide. All right, so that's all reflected in these five action words that represent the course of Jewish history. Hotzeti, I'll take you out. Hitzalti, I'll save you. Ga'alti, I'll redeem you. Lakachti, I'll take you. And Heveti, I'll bring you. Okay. The last thing I wanted to talk about is from the start of chapter 7, which is on page 356, which is actually on page 357. But let's read the first three sentences, 356 and 357 of chapter 7. Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, Re'ei netaticha Elohim lefaro, v'yaharon achicha yihiyeh neviecha. God, Adonai, said to Moses, see, I have presented you as a god to Pharaoh, and Aaron, your brother, will be your spokesperson. Ata tedaber et kol asher atzaveka, ve'aharon achicha yedaber el paro, ve'shilach et bnei Yisrael me'artzo. You will speak everything I command you, and Aaron, your brother, will speak to Pharaoh, and he'll cast out or send out the children of Israel from his land. And the big point that I wanted to talk about is Va'ani akshe et leiv paro, v'hir beiti et ototai ve'et moftai be'eretz Mitzrayim. And I will harden the heart of Pharaoh, and I'll make many signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. So this phrase, I will harden the heart of Pharaoh, provides a tremendous amount of commentary throughout the ages. So if you go on Sefaria, which is really like the online Jewish library, instead of pulling off books off my shelf to see all the references to this verse and all the commentaries, Sefaria has it right there in front of you. Go to this verse, you highlight the verse, and on the side then comes up all the places where this verse appears. So in just a section called commentary, which is Rashi and others who are just commenting line by line on the Torah, there are at least 250 comments to this verse. Okay? And then there's Midrash, and then there's Jewish thought, and then there's Hasidism, and then there's mysticism on this verse as well. So lots and lots of commentary on this verse. And what I wanted to talk about is the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. So the how we understand the Torah helps us understand how we how the authorship of the Torah influences how we understand God hardening Pharaoh's heart. If we say God wrote the Torah, then we have before us a very stark description of God's role in the world around us. Not only is God going to be bringing the signs and wonders, which are external things that are happening around us, but God is in Pharaoh's heart and mind, determining how Pharaoh's going to act. So what that is teaching us is that, yes, God did it at that time because God said that God did it, but ultimately God can do that all the time. That God works in the world around us, determines what will happen in the world around us, and also God works in our minds and our hearts, which is a very scary thing, because that means then, carrying this to the extreme, is that God made Hitler, and God determined that Hitler would do that. So this presents to us a very, it's one thing if good things are happening. The signs and wonders in Egypt on behalf of the people of Israel, those are arguably very positive, awesome things. And we don't mind God doing wonderful things. The challenge is when bad things are happening and tragic things are happening, right? Egyptians had to die as a result of those plagues in order for us to be free, which is why we take drops of wine out of our cup of wine at the Seder when we recite the 10 plagues, to allow us to understand that we are human and that we should recognize the suffering of other people. And the tragedies that happen are those that God determines as well, including how people act. So that's a very challenging thing to accept. I'm not saying that it's impossible to accept, and there's certainly traditional Jews in the Jewish community who still understand this today as the way that the world works. And there's a way around it. Repentance certainly can affect the role of God in the world around us, and also a sense that that people should rise up and act against people who are acting in an evil way, right? So it's a challenging perspective to have that I personally don't buy into, because I think for me personally, it's too challenging to live in this world, and to pray to a God that has more of an impact with terrible things than there is an impact with positive things. And that, for me and many modern people, it's just too harsh of a God to believe in. That it's, for moderns, the belief in a compassionate, benevolent God is the God that is the one to believe in, and this doesn't allow for that. So what does allow for that would be to understand that the Torah was not written by God, but rather written by human beings, and this is a human perspective or a human opinion of how God works in the world. Okay, so that's easier to understand and to accept, so that the author of the Torah or the editors of the Torah had this approach, understanding that what happened in Egypt was nothing else than a miracle, and certainly reflected how God intervened in the world at that time. But It's just their perspective. And we can understand that maybe God works in that way. Maybe we want God to act in that way. But maybe really the way the world works is that there's a natural order to things, and we try to make the best of it. So hardening Pharaoh's heart is just a perspective on why Pharaoh refused for so long, after so many plagues, not to let the people go. It must be, the author or editor, as if God is hardening Pharaoh's heart. There could be no other explanation for Pharaoh's stubbornness. That could be another way of understanding God's role in the story. Either the traditional way that God actually was involved in a story, or this non-traditional way that it's as if God is acting in the story. So that's what I wanted to share from this week's Torah portion. Any thoughts or comments about this before we call it a day? So this isn't new, what I've shared with you. It's just that this portion is one of several in which these ideas of God and God's role in the world around us come out and allow us for these interpretations. So have a good rest of the day, everybody. Most likely next Wednesday, there will not be a Torah study class because I'll be in New York. Yeah, not just most likely, definitely. There won't be a Torah study next week, so we'll meet again the following week. So 2 weeks from today, January 28th, will be our next session for Torah study. Have a good rest of the day, everybody. Take care.
Thank you. Have a good trip.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.